Oh, hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I didn't see you there, I was too busy playing on my GKD Pixel. I reviewed this device a few months back, and I gotta say that ever since reviewing it, I've been playing it more and more. And some of that has to do with the fact that I've been messing around with the operating system in the background. In fact, that was one of my main sticking points in the review. I really loved the custom firmware that we can use for it, including MinUI, but it had some limitations to it, and that's what I was trying to overcome. Well, I think we're finally at the point where I'm ready to show off all this work and explain why it's been fixing a lot of the problems that I had with this device 3 months back. And we're going to discuss why it might be worth reconsidering whether or not to pick up this tiny little handheld. And before we get started, let me give you a quick recap. I have integrated these stock emulators back into the MinUI experience, which means you'll be able to play things like arcade games, but then also get better performance with certain emulators like Super Nintendo and PlayStation. And the great thing is that you can integrate both the MinUI emulators and the stock ones in the exact same user interface. In addition, I've added a couple other neat integrations, including a Pico 8 emulator as well as an MP3 player. So let's go ahead and take another look at the GKD Pixel and the exciting changes that have happened to it over the past few months. Without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump in. Okay, as we get started, a quick recap of the specs. And first and foremost, this is not a very powerful device. It will cap out at PS1. What really sets it apart is the fact that it's made out of a metal shell, which makes it a little bit more rugged, and it's also super small and pocketable. To give you an idea, this thing weighs 107 grams, or about 3.5 ounces. And so in that regard, this device sits very firmly in the micro console space. And when it comes to this category, it's not about the screen size or the ergonomics, it's more about portability. It's just something that you can just throw in your pocket and then take out anytime. And in terms of size, even within this category, it is relatively small. I would put it somewhere between the Amronic RG Nano on the left and the MiU Mini regular version on the right. And this is one of those things that I really tried to touch upon in my review, is the fact that this is a micro handheld which has a very specific use case. And I think right off the bat it's going to exclude a lot of people, those who want to have a larger screen experience as opposed to something that's super portable. But for me personally, I like these little handhelds, and so that's probably one of the reasons why I've been playing it so much. Now let's talk about the 5 things that I liked and the 5 things I didn't like about the GKD Pixel a few months back when I made my review. And right off the bat, I would say the first 3 things I liked about this device kind of go hand in hand. I love the fact that it has a metal shell, which makes it feel mostly rugged, but then also it has these really clicky and tactile controls. After making the video, I realized that the D-pad and buttons are actually made out of metal as well, and so that really increases the tactile feeling too. But far and away, my favorite thing about it is just how pocketable it is. I find that the more pocketable a device is, the more apt I am to actually use it. And I've described this particular size in other videos before, where usually I will call it inconsequentially small. By that I mean it's something that you can just throw in and out of your pocket, and it's not going to take up a bunch of room. So there is still space for things like your keys or your phone while also carrying this thing around. And because it's the type of device I can always keep in my pocket, that means that I'll have it available more times than not. And so just at random times, if I just have a spare moment, I can pull it out and start playing for a few minutes. And you never realize how many of those situations are really going to pop up until you have a device already in your pocket. So this is one of those things that I really liked about the device 3 months ago, and I still really like it now. Now, when I first made my review, there was an early version of MinUI, which is a custom operating system available for the device already. And so I did show it off in that review, and it's still my preferred operating system for this little handheld. It has a super clean and easy to use interface, but it also has a pretty robust option system and some other perks that I'll describe later in this video. And compared to the stock operating system, I found this overall navigation experience to be worlds better, and so this is what I focused on with all my work over the past few months. And finally, I think there's no denying the fact that this just looks very nice. It's just a cool looking little handheld. Now, I think it's no surprise the things that I liked 3 months ago, I still like today. It really comes down to the things I didn't like and how things have changed since then. So let's talk about the things that I didn't like about it back then. First is the fact that the screen feels fragile. And honestly, there's not a lot we can do here other than hope that a tiny little screen protector will come out for this device, but as it stands right now, yeah, I've been worried about getting this thing scratched in my pocket. And so ever since getting this device, I've been using it with my water-filled micro wallet. Now this thing is a little bit on the expensive side, it's $25, but I think it's a perfect fit for this handheld. Not only is there space for the handheld as well as a microfiber cloth, but you can also throw in some credit cards and some cash and it'll all fit. And so this is how I've chosen to carry around the device, so that way I make sure that it doesn't get scratched in my pocket. Now I'm not a huge fan of having to spend another $25 just to be able to protect my device, but all the same, that combination has worked out well for me. Okay, the next thing I didn't like about the device is that it felt rather boxy and cramped. Now, some of these things can't be changed. For example, it has kind of sharp edges to it, and there's no getting around the fact that it can feel pretty darn cramped depending on the game that you're playing. So when it comes to action-heavy titles, something like a platforming game, especially those where you have to press multiple buttons, yeah, I don't think this is a very good fit. However, I found it especially good when it comes to role-playing games as well as puzzle games, things like Tetris. And so part of that had to do with me adjusting the type of games that I was playing, but yeah, when it comes to the hardware itself, it's not getting any bigger or more comfortable. And honestly, this always comes part and parcel with the whole micro handheld thing in the first place. These devices are designed to be pick up and play, not necessarily something that you're going to be playing on the couch for hours on end. So I think that's another one of the nitpicks I didn't like about this device that hasn't really changed over time, and I don't think it will. Another thing that's still the same is the fact that it does get a little bit warm, especially if you're going to be pushing it, like trying to play a lot of PS1 games. Now, like I mentioned in the review, this amount of warmth is not to the point where it's distracting or a negative thing per se, but it is something that I noticed. And so I do like leaving this one just as a quick caution, in the sense that if you don't like a device that gets warm, this won't be a good fit. Another complaint I had about the device is that it was pricey, and I even put in here for now, and that was because the developer had said they were going to try to drive down the price over the course of this year. And when the device was first launched, it was $90, and I did find that to be quite expensive for what you were getting. Well, I am happy to report that the price has gone down quite a bit depending on where you look. For example, if we go back to KeepRetro.com, which is the supplier who sent me my review unit, you can see that the price has gone down $12. It's now $78 with free shipping. I think it's still a little bit on the expensive side right here for what you're getting, but it is nice to see that the price has gone down by those 12 bucks. But also, if you go to the AliExpress website and search for the GKD Pixel, you'll find it for a lot cheaper. For example, there are 3 listings for $66 right now. So really, the price difference here is about 25% less than it was when I first made that review, and I think that is not insignificant. Personally, I think it's going to be a better fit around $55 or $60, and I think we're getting pretty close to that now. And then finally, the last point of the things that I didn't like about the GKD Pixel is that we didn't have a perfect software solution just yet. Even though I loved the MinUI experience, I felt that it had some pretty significant shortcomings. The first is that the emulator cores used within MinUI were not as performant as the stock emulators. And this was very clear in some of these Super Nintendo games that are harder to run, as well as the majority of PS1 games. And so even though MinUI really enhanced the overall experience, the actual gameplay left a lot to be desired. In addition, by design, MinUI is meant to only support a small number of cores. And one platform in particular, which I thought was a very good fit with the GKD Mini, were arcade games, and unfortunately MinUI does not officially support them. So it felt a bit like a compromise in the sense that you could get a really nice user experience, but the gameplay was just not quite there. And so that's what I ended up focusing on when I was trying to make my own additions to the MinUI experience. It took me a few months and quite a few revisions, but I think we're finally there and it's time to share it. First and foremost, before we get too far into it, let me just explain that a lot of these updates came from the MinUI developer himself. We kind of poked and prodded at the whole experience to kind of find something that was a good middle ground between what he had in the original MinUI and then what we could add to improve it on the GKD Pixel. But all the same, let's talk about this update and what it's going to provide to the GKD Pixel. To start, everything is explained in detail in the GitHub page that I'll have linked in the video description below. So if you want to actually try this yourself, just go ahead and follow that link. And we're going to do a full installation later in this video, but before that, I want to show you what the finished product looks like so that way you can see whether or not it's going to be worth it for you. We'll start by just the overall MinUI experience. One of my favorite things about it is that it boots up so fast. In fact, it boots up in under 7 seconds. And so let's look at the overall experience now, which will include all the add-on pack stuff that I've integrated into my GitHub page. The first thing you're going to notice is there are new platforms available in the user interface, including arcade games. And once you go into the arcade systems interface, the first thing you may notice is that it's not showing the full arcade names. It's only going to be showing the name of the zip file. Unfortunately, this is one of the limitations of my programming knowledge. I'm not sure how to set this up, but if you do know how, please reach out to me. Unfortunately, this is what happens when a YouTuber tries to pretend to be a developer. I just don't know how to set that up. So as it stands, if you do want to play arcade games, at least right now, you will have to just kind of get used to seeing these zip file names. For me personally, after spending years with these different file names, I know exactly which game is which, but it might take a minute to acclimate to this experience. It's not the prettiest thing in the world, but it will allow you to boot up your game. And so here's how it's going to work. After you add the arcade game to the corresponding folder, it's going to show up in the menu. And when you launch that game, instead of opening up a MinUI core like with the other systems, it's going to go through and open up the stock emulator instead. And so it's kind of the best of both worlds. We get this really nice user interface, but then we can also use the stock emulators, which have the best performance compared to some of those other cores. Anyway, once you're done playing the game, you can exit out of it just like you would any other stock emulator. So you'll tap on the menu button on the right, and that'll bring up this emulator's menu interface. From there, you can just choose to exit. And that's really how the arcade games are going to work, but there are a couple quirks that are worth mentioning. The first thing is that by default, the Final Burn Alpha emulator, which is what we're going to be using here, actually rotates all vertical games onto their side. And as far as I can tell, this is not something that you can switch back within the configuration menu. Now, I think this is a good and a bad thing. It'll make vertical shooters fill up the whole screen, but it does mean you'll have to rotate the device, and it's a little bit weird to have the D-pad below the face buttons. Either way, I think that after a minute or so, you'll get used to it, and it's a pretty neat way to be able to play these games and have them take up the full screen. Another thing of note is that this emulator is not perfect. Some of the harder to play arcade games, including Ninja Baseball Batman, do not play at full speed. Now, when it comes to 80s and 90s games, these type of games that have slowdown are very few and far between. And so for the vast majority of arcade classic games, performance won't be an issue, but I did want to mention that not every game is going to play perfectly. Now, in addition to adding just your standard arcade games, I also added the Neo Geo emulator as well. In fact, it's the same Final Burn Alpha standalone emulator that we were just using, but I've given it its own category and folder. And that's really because I prefer to separate out my Neo Geo ROMs, but if you want to just throw them into the arcade folder, they will also work that way as well. Either way, it's going to be the exact same experience here. You're going to put your Neo Geo ROMs inside of the Neo Geo folder, and don't forget the neogeo.zip BIOS file. Once you have that set up, you're good to go to play any Neo Geo game. All of these performed really well. But also bear in mind that the naming convention for these is going to be the same, so you're only going to see the zip file name, and so some of these may not make a whole lot of sense. Now, this next point is super exciting for me. When it comes to some of those harder to run systems like Super Nintendo and PlayStation, we now have a workaround to make sure that most of these games are going to play great. And it does take a little bit of work on the back end, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment, but once you have it set up, the front end experience is going to be perfectly seamless. And for the majority of Super Nintendo games, I would say at least 75, maybe even 80% of the games, they're going to play just fine with this standard core. And one of the great things about using MinUI is that you will have the full MinUI menu system available as well when you press that menu button on the right side. That's going to include things like save states and per game configurations. Now, in addition to the MinUI user interface, it also unlocks other MinUI features. For example, MinUI has a working sleep function, so if you tap on the power button, it's going to put the device to sleep. In addition, MinUI supports quick save and auto resume functions. To do this while playing a game, press and hold the power button for a few seconds. It's going to say that a quick save was created and that it's powering off. After that, it's going to be in a full shut-off mode, but if you press and hold the power button again, it's going to bring everything back up. Not only will it start up MinUI very quickly, again, it's going to take about 7 seconds to start it up, but it's also going to remember exactly where you were in that game. So that's one of the benefits of using the MinUI system, and like I said, like 75% of Super Nintendo games are going to play just fine like that. Now, for the small portion of Super Nintendo games that don't play at full speed using the MinUI emulator, we now have a second option. And what you do here is you put those games in a special alternative folder, and that's going to tell MinUI to launch it using the standalone emulator instead. So games like Mario World 2 will still show up in the MinUI interface, but I put them in a different folder. And that means that when I launch it, it's going to launch the standalone emulator instead. And this standalone emulator performs a lot better. I'm not here to say that every single Super Nintendo game is going to play flawlessly, but it's going to be a lot better than with the MinUI emulator. For example, here with Super Mario World 2, you can see that it's running at a pretty steady 60 frames per second. The game itself does feel a little bit off. Maybe it's using some sort of frame skip, but but either way, it's a lot more playable than it was before. And if we press the menu button on the right, you can see that it brings up the standalone emulator menu instead. Now, the stock emulator experience is both good and bad. It's great that some of these games will now play at full speed, but unfortunately, some MinUI features do not work with the standalone emulator. The most glaring example is that sleep, as well as the quick save and auto resume functions, will not work if you have to use the standalone emulator. So it is a bit of a trade-off in the sense that if you're done playing a game with the standalone emulator, you'll have to exit it and then power it off manually. So kind of like with our arcade setup, and the fact that we had those zip files that didn't look that pretty, there is a little bit of a compromise to get this all working. Either way, for me personally, I think it's well worth it to be able to have some games that weren't fully playable with MinUI now being playable. Now, some of these games are still not going to play at full speed. Star Fox is a great example. This one is definitely using auto frame skip, so even though it is running pretty quickly, it's still not a perfect emulation experience. All the same, I think this is still way better than it was when trying to use the MinUI core. It's going to be a very similar experience when it comes to PlayStation 1. There are going to be some games that run just fine with the standard core, but I did find that the majority of games played better with the standalone emulator, and just about every game played great once you did that. So even the hard to run games like Tekken 3 are still playable. There's a little bit of compromise. It usually runs at about 58 instead of 60 frames per second, but it's still a huge improvement over the MinUI core. And so if you want to play PS1 games, I would recommend kind of mixing and matching and find out which ones are going to work best with MinUI and which ones are going to require the standalone emulator instead. And thankfully, these standalone emulators are still pretty mature in the sense that they have save states and per game configurations, and so you're not losing a lot of functionality other than that sleep and then the auto resume. Now, another thing that's included in my add-on pack is the Pico 8 emulator. This one is kind of weird because the MinUI system usually has support for Pico 8 right out of the box, but unfortunately the core was not installed on this one. And I think it has to do with the fact that it's not a perfect emulation experience when trying to play Pico 8 games using the Faco 8 emulator. Either way, I've added it back, so if you just install my add-on pack like we'll do later in this video, you will be able to play Pico 8 games on this device. And the functionality of the Pico 8 emulator will really depend on the game itself and how complicated its development was. For example, when you try to play older games like the original Celeste, everything works perfectly. You'll be able to use it with the MinUI interface and all of the features that come with it, and you'll also be able to use save states and load them accordingly. However, more modern Pico 8 games, especially those that are multi-cart games, don't seem to work at all. And again, I think that's a limitation of that emulator core. My advice would be to just try all of the Pico 8 games that you want, and then maybe delete out the ones that don't actually load. Personally, the Pico 8 game I just can't stop playing is the Suica Watermelon Demake game, and I've been playing this one for about 3 weeks at this point. And this one kind of works okay with the emulator. The gameplay itself is just fine, but the audio is a little bit inaccurate, and even though you can save a state, when you try to load it, it's going to freeze the entire system and require you to do a hard reboot. So it's really going to come down to the specific Pico 8 game and whether or not it's going to work, but it is pretty cool to have these on the platform again. Okay, and finally, the last thing I wanted to show off about this add-on pack is the tools section at the bottom. Now, some of these tools actually come with MinUI, including these first three right here. The first is going to be a clock function, so if you want to set the internal clock, for example, if you're playing a Pokemon game, you can totally do that. And also there's a file manager app, so if you want to go in and maybe delete out a game without having to take out your SD card, you can do that within this app. And finally, another app that's included within MinUI is an input tester. So if you want to make sure all your buttons are working correctly, you can test that within here. Now, the other tools that you'll find at the bottom are actually ones that are from my add-on pack. The first is that I've reintegrated the MP3 player within this device. And I found this to work pretty darn well. I'm not an audiophile, and so I have untrained ears, but all the same, for my own tastes, it's been working out really well. And the app supports both MP3 files as well as FLAC files, so if you want to have high quality audio, you can definitely do that on this device. And if you play your music files without the headphone jack plugged in, it's just going to play through the mono speaker. It sounds okay, but not like really super nice. And you can play the audio through the headphone jack, and it sounds great. I'm not going to play any audio here. I don't want to get any sort of copyright strikes, but all the same, yeah, this is going to be a working MP3 player. Now, the text is small and the user interface is a little bit hard to use, but it does have some nice features. For example, after 30 seconds of not using it, it'll turn the screen off to save your battery. And then finally, I've added a revert stock tool. Now, this was made by the MinUI developer, but he gave me permission to add it to my add-on pack in case you want to go back to the stock firmware. Okay, so that's a quick recap of all the features and upgrades that have happened to the GKD Pixel. So now let's talk about how easy it is to install all this stuff. And first things first, I'm assuming here that you have a stock SD card that came with your device. If you don't have one, I have instructions on my GitHub page on how to flash a new card with the stock operating system. Either way, the first thing we want to do is download the MinUI software files. You can find those on the MinUI GitHub page. Once you're here, navigate to the releases page, which you will find on the bottom right. Once you're here, you want to download both zip files, the base one as well as the extras one. Now the next step is optional, but I do recommend it, especially if you only have one stock SD card. And what we're going to do here is back up this card in case you want to flash a new one sometime later. And backing up this card is not as easy as just copy and pasting, and that's because some of these partitions are Linux based, which means we need to back up the whole card. To do this, I recommend using an app called Win32 Disk Imager. Once you have that installed on your computer, go ahead and open it up, and then go and click on this little file folder thing here on the right. From there, navigate to wherever it is you want to save your image file. Now this is going to be a large image. It's going to be about 64 gigs because it's the same size as the card. Either way, just go ahead and give it a name that you'll remember. For me, I'm just going to put GKD Pixel Backup. And then also cap it out with a .img file extension. You have to write this in manually. After that's done, click on Open, and then on the far right, you'll see an option for Device. It's going to show you all of the different partitions for your SD card. I generally recommend picking the last one. That's going to be your ROMs partition, which is going to be the biggest one. But in the end, it really doesn't matter which one you pick. Once you're ready, click on that Read button on the bottom. And that's really about it. It could take anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour to actually read the entire file system and make that image file. So that'll be a perfect time to grab a snack and drink and maybe play your favorite retro game. Anyway, like I mentioned, this is an optional step, but I do recommend it in case something goes wrong. Now let's actually get to installing MinUI. The first thing I want to do is go into the SD card into that ROMs partition. And chances are your file system is going to look very similar to this. Now with MinUI, you don't actually need any of these files, but all the same, I don't think it's worth deleting all of them. Instead, I would recommend making a folder, calling it stock, and then grabbing all of those other files and folders and move them into that new stock folder. And this is going to include all of the ROMs that came on that 64 gigabyte card, so you're not going to lose any games during this process. Anyway, once you've moved everything over and kind of cleaned up the whole file system, we're now ready to install MinUI. So here's how we're going to do it. On the left side, you can see my SD card, and then on the right side, you can see the two MinUI files that we just downloaded a minute ago. And first up, we want to open up the base zip file. Here, you're going to find a bunch of different folders and files. It might look a little bit intimidating, but I would recommend going to the README text file. If you scroll down about a third of the way down, you will see the GKD Pixel instructions. And within here, you will see that we've already done the first paragraph where we've backed up our SD card, and we also made a stock folder and put all of our stuff in there. So now we're ready to do the next step, which is to put the MinUI files on the SD card. And to do this, we only need to move over two things, the GKD Pixel folder and then the MinUI.zip file. So just grab those and then move them over into the SD card and we are good to go. You can close out of the base.zip file and then eject the SD card and we can now put it into our device. Now when you first put it in the device, it's going to look exactly like your stock operating system experience. And that's because we haven't installed MinUI just yet. To do that, we need to run a specific shell command. So you're going to find that under the app section and then you'll find an icon that says File Manager. Click on that using the A button. This is going to bring up our file manager, and it's a little bit hard to read here on the screen just because the text looks a little bit washed out and everything is really small. Either way, what you want to do is navigate to this specific file. It's going to be found under Media, then ROMs, then GKD Pixel, and the file itself will be called install.sh. Once you find that file, click on the A button, and it's going to ask you, do you want to view it or execute the file? We're going to choose execute. This will run the shell script, which will then install MinUI. This is going to take maybe a minute or so altogether, but once it's done, you're going to see this menu. It's going to say empty folder. And that's because even though we've now installed MinUI, we haven't added anything yet. So that's going to be our next step. Let's go ahead and power off this device and then take out the SD card and put it back into our computer. Now when you pop in the SD card, it's likely that a bunch of things are going to happen. The first is all of those Linux partitions are going to show up, but then also you might see an error that says something like there's a problem with the ROMs drive. And this really isn't a big deal, it just is the fact that this is a FAT32 formatted card and this will happen from time to time. So I recommend going through the prompts to scan and quote unquote repair the drive. You'll find that every time it's going to scan the drive and then it won't find any errors, so no big deal there. Either way, I would recommend just closing out of all of these windows that popped up because it can get pretty confusing. After that, you can open up a new window and then navigate to your ROMs partition on the SD card. And this is exactly where we were a minute ago when we installed MinUI. However, now you can see that it has a different file system. That's because MinUI installed a bunch of things during that process. Either way, now we're ready for the fun stuff, which is going to include things like adding our BIOS and ROM files. To start, we're going to open up that base.zip file again. Now you want to grab 3 different folders, the one called BIOS, ROMs, and Saves. Now these are actually all blank, but all the same, they have the folder structure that you're going to want to use. And so it'll only take a moment to move these over. Now we're going to do something similar, but with the extras pack. This will include additional emulators that are going to be really handy. So here we want to grab everything but the README file and then move them over. Once that's done, we are ready to install the add-on pack that I created. So here you're going to want to go back to my GitHub page and then go into the releases section. From there, find the latest release. As of right now, it's actually version 4, and then click on the link that says source code zip. From there, download that file and then open it up, and you'll find 3 different folders here: emulators, ROMs, and tools. Grab all of these and then move them over onto that SD card. Now we've added all of the folders that we need in order to set up our entire system. So let's go ahead and start moving over our BIOS and ROMs files. Now these are all copyrighted, so I'm not going to show you specifically how to do that, but I do want to point to the fact that in the BIOS folder, there are very few BIOS that you actually have to add. The only systems that absolutely need it are going to include PlayStation 1, and then also if you want to play PC Engine or TurboGrafx CD games, you'll want to use that BIOS file. And same thing with Sega CD. If you want to play that, you're going to add them to the MD or Mega Drive folder. Now, if you have any questions about the BIOS files, I would recommend checking out the MinUI zip file. Within there, you'll find that README text document. And if you scroll down about halfway down, you will find a BIOS section. There, it's going to show the exact BIOS files that you need, and bear in mind that the file names are case sensitive. Now, because we're using both the base and the extras pack, then I would recommend checking out both README files because each of them will have the specific BIOS files listed. Either way, that's how you add the BIOS files, and like I mentioned, only a few of them are actually necessary. Some of them are optional. Okay, after you've added your BIOS files, now you're going to want to add your ROM files. You've got a couple ways of doing this. The first is to just add your own from your own library, but also remember that we saved off all of those other old ROM files that came with the device. So if you want a very easy way to add games to this, then I would just pull them out of that old stock folder that we made earlier. Either way, let's talk about some of the nuances that come when you want to add these ROM files. We'll start with the arcade systems because there are 3 different emulators that you can use. There's Final Burn Alpha 35, 44, as well as Final Burn Neo. Now, in my testing, I found that Final Burn Alpha 35 is the most performant and also the most compatible. So when you're adding your arcade games, make sure that they are compatible with Final Burn Alpha 35. And once you have all of those files, put them in that Final Burn Alpha 35 folder. And it's the same story when it comes to Neo Geo. I have found that Final Burn Alpha 35 works the best. So when getting a Neo Geo ROM set, make sure that it is compatible with Final Burn Alpha 35. If you don't know what any of that means, but you do want to play arcade games, then I would recommend checking out my README file on the GitHub page. Now, the next 3 systems are the ones that are really interesting. These are the ones that have alternative folders. And this includes Game Boy Advance, as well as Super Nintendo and Sony PlayStation. So the way this works is pretty simple. If the game works just fine with the MinUI core, then put it in the regular folder. However, if you want to boot that game with the stock emulator, then put it in the alt folder instead. When you actually navigate through MinUI, it's all going to look the same, but when you launch the game, it's all going to depend on where you put it in the folder. So my own advice is that for Game Boy Advance, I found that basically all of them work just fine with MinUI, but I put that alternative core in there in case you come upon one that does have issues. When it comes to Super Nintendo, the majority of them are going to play just fine with the MinUI core, but if you run into any problematic games, that includes those like Super Mario RPG or Star Fox or Mario World 2, then put those in the alternative folder instead. When it comes to Sony PlayStation, I recommend putting them into the alternative folder by default because the majority of them will not work well with MinUI. However, one thing to bear in mind is the standalone emulator does not work with CHD files. So you're going to want to use ISO, image, BinQ, or PBP files instead. Next, there are going to be 2 folders where you can put multiple systems in the same folder. And that's going to include Sega Genesis as well as TurboGrafx 16 or PC Engine. And that's because there are multiple systems that use the same core and same folder. So for example, with Sega Genesis, you can put in those Sega Genesis games as well as Sega CD and 32X games. And you can just throw them all in the same folder and they're going to show up in the same interface. And the same thing with TurboGrafx 16 or PC Engine. You can throw in your standard 16-bit games, but you can also throw in the CD games and they're all going to show up as well. So here's my example. If we go into the Sega Genesis folder, you can see that it's a collection of both Sega Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X games. And so this is really handy for me because it minimizes the amount of folders you'll have to navigate through, but you'll still be able to play all the systems that are supported. And same thing with TurboGrafx-16. This is a collection of both TurboGrafx-16 games and TurboGrafx-CD games. And I think it's great to be able to have all these games boot from the same user interface. And that's really it when it comes to setting up your BIOS files as well as your games. However, there's one other thing I wanted to show off, and that's how to add your own music files. So first thing you want to do is set up a place to put these music files. We're just going to put this directly on the root directory of the SD card. We'll make a folder called music. From there, I've already picked out 3 of my favorite 90s ska albums, and so I'm going to move those over into that music folder. And that's really about it. Once you're in the music app, you will go through and navigate and start up these files yourself. And of note, like I mentioned before, this will work with lossless music, so you can play FLAC files. And it also works with MP3 files. I tested it with 320-bit files and they all worked great. However, one thing of note, M4A files, these are like Apple's iTunes files, these ones do not work. And so unfortunately, you'll have to stick with MP3 and FLAC. Anyway, once you've added your music files and you start up the music player, the first time you start it up, it's actually going to show you a README file. And within there, it's going to walk you through how to use the app. It's not super intuitive, but the audio quality is very good. This app is called GMU. It's been around forever. If you've ever tried to play music on a Linux-based handheld, you've probably used this before. Either way, it does have a pretty robust feature set, including like setting up playlists and things like that. And really, that's about it for this video. I wanted to take another look at the GKD Pixel, especially in light of all these software updates that really improve the user experience. It kind of feels like I have my cake and that I'm eating it too. Not only do I have the beautiful MinUI user interface, but I can also play my favorite systems, including arcade games. Like I mentioned in my review, I think that GKD Pixel is a perfect fit for arcade gaming. And that's because this device in particular is made to be like a pick up and play experience. And it's the exact same thing when it comes to arcade games. These are games that used to just throw a quarter in when you're walking by, maybe play for a few minutes. And I think the GKD Pixel is one of those few devices that really captures that same spirit. Now, of course, there are plenty of other systems that play perfectly fine on this device, including things like Game Boy and Game Boy Color. I think those are a really good fit, especially with this form factor. And of course, it's no slouch when it comes to your favorite 8 and 16-bit systems, including things like Game Boy Advance. So at the end of the day, even though I was pretty impressed with the GKD Pixel a few months ago, I really like it a lot more now. Now, there's a lot of competition in the micro handheld space, and to be honest, this one is not my #1 choice when it comes to a small handheld. I still would consider the TrimUI Smart to be my favorite micro handheld, but that really comes down to the horizontal form factor. I personally find that to be just a lot more comfortable overall. And I made a whole video about this one and why it's my favorite. I'll also leave that link down below. Now, the ironic thing is that even though I enjoy the TrimUI Smart more, it's the GKD Pixel that I've been playing more. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's more rugged and pocketable, and so as a result, I do take it around more often. So let me know what you think about the GKD Pixel in the comments down below. Have you been considering getting one of these, or is it too small for you? And what do you think of these software updates? Does that make it a little bit more of a bargain for you? I think that, in combination with the fact that the price is dropping on this device, does mean that it has a pretty bright future here through 2024. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.